Hi there, everyone. Bryan here from the Oraculos School of Astrology with another episode of Planetary Pairs, where I take you through all of the planets that we use within a neoclassical astrological approach, and I tell you what they mean when they are paired with other planets. Now, by neoclassical astrology, I'm referring to a version of astrology in which we use the seven classical planets of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon, but I'm also referring to those of us in the 21st century who unashamedly also use Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto within our astrology. So if this is your first time joining us, please take a moment and go down below and hit the subscription button. We are currently on a mission to manifest 12,000 subscribers across all of our platforms because we make some pretty amazing astrological content here at the Oraculos School of Astrology. So give yourself a moment, go down below, hit the subscription button, whether you're listening to us here on YouTube or Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you have the opportunity to hear us. Please do that so that more and more people can know about the amazing work we're doing over here at the Oraculos School of Astrology. Now, before we dive into today's presentation on the moon, which I'm very excited about, I do want to let you all know why we're giving away all of this information for free here at the Oraculos School of Astrology. In January 2024, we have our upcoming Uranian Astrology for Practicing Astrologers program, and that begins at the end of January 2024, in which I will teach you everything you need to know in order to practice natal-based Uranian astrology within the context of your client work. Now, for those of you who don't know, Uranian astrology is one of my astrological passions, and Uranian astrology for me really represents a system of concrete event-based astrology. So if you are a practicing astrologer and you know how to read a chart psychologically up the wazoo, and you want to deepen your astrological understanding, and you also want to improve the level of clarity, accuracy, and the concrete nature of the readings that you give to yourself as well as to your clients, then by all means join us this January for our upcoming Uranian Astrology for Practicing Astrologers Intensive. That's really all I have to say about that. You can find out more information by visiting our website at www.oraculosastrology.com. And finally, I do want to say thank you so much to all of you who have supported me with your love and your comments and your feedback since the publication of my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, A Depth of Beginning in the Celestial Art. As I think everyone knows at this point, I'm a self-published author, so all of the support that you can give in terms of buying the book, commenting on the book, sharing the book with your friends and your other astrological colleagues, it means a lot to me. If you love mastering traditional astrology and if it's deepened your astrological practice in any way whatsoever, and if it feels comfortable to you, then please leave us a 5-star review over on Amazon.com. As a self-published author, Amazon doesn't really do much to promote the book for me unless it's getting high-quality 5-star written reviews. So if you haven't done so already, and if you feel drawn to do so, then please do leave us a 5-star review over on Amazon.com, letting people know what you love about mastering traditional astrology. Now, without further ado, here is today's episode of Planetary Pairs, in which we're going to be diving into all of the planetary combinations with the moon. I'm very excited about this because when we talk about the moon, we go deep. So I'm looking forward to sharing this amazing content with you today. Do enjoy. In last week's episode, I spoke about planetary pairs with the sun. And I spoke about the glyph of the sun and how the sun is composed of this dot in the center of a circle, and how that dot in the center of the circle is meant to reference this larger reality of the individualizing properties that the sun creates for all of us. So when we speak about the astrological sun, we're speaking about a force that has the ability to allow us to be individualized and in radiant expression. And that's what that dot in the center of the sun represents. It represents this point of singularity within a larger field of possibility. And that's why, from a Uranian astrology perspective, the sun is specifically representing our physical body that we move through this material world in. Now, the glyph of the moon, on the other hand, is composed of the crescent. And from a Hermetic perspective, the crescent represents a field of unbridled potential. And it also represents a field of unbridled chaos. Now, I speak about this deeply in my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, in the chapter on the Hermetic philosophy of our precosmos, in which I speak about the three parts of the glyph of Mercury: the crescent, the circle, and the cross. And if you haven't read that chapter already, then please give yourself a moment, go and read that chapter, because we really go deep in terms of deconstructing this symbol of the glyph of Mercury and also showing why Mercury is the most important planet from an astrological perspective, based on the ways in which Mercury brings together this concept of the crescent, the circle, and the cross. But this moon glyph, this lunar glyph, is meant to refer to our alma mater. The moon glyph is meant to refer to the all mother out of which all of us proceed and from which all of us originate within this lifetime. So when we take a look at the moon glyph, what we're seeing is something that is open to all possibilities, and therefore that moon glyph holds within itself all possibilities. So the moon glyph is of extraordinary importance, and from a cosmological perspective, the ancient alchemists thought that the principle of the moon, this raw chaos, these raw forces of nature, unbridled, untamed, were actually here far before the individualizing principles that we find within the sun. So when we look back at ancient mythology and we hear these stories of how Hercules had to battle the Nemean lion, or how Hercules had to battle the Hydra, the many-headed Hydra, and every time he chopped a head off, three more heads would erupt. Or when we hear these stories of these solar heroes battling these forces of nature in the form of monsters and dragons and hydras and lions and all of these things, what it's meant to represent is the fundamental battle that exists between the singularity of the individual process that the sun represents and the universality and the raw, crude, chaotic field of endless possibility that the moon represents. And so the sun glyph specifically is very profound, because when we look at the sun glyph, what we see is something that affirms itself as a singularity within a larger cosmic field of potential, but that larger cosmic field of potential is what we refer to when we look at the moon glyph. So there's this sense within the moon that the moon represents our cosmic root within this lifetime. Avraham ibn Ezra tells us that the moon should be studied within every astrological operation, because the moon is our cosmic root to the universe. When we think about our material world, the ancients referred to our material world as the sublunar sphere. And the reason for that is because in the Chaldean order, we start with Saturn and we work our way inward from Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the moon. And so the sphere of the moon was directly above the sphere of our material plane. And therefore, since our material plane is under the sphere of the moon, we call our material world the sublunar sphere. So there's this sense within traditional astrology that it is through the sublunar sphere that all of the cosmic nutrients of all of the other planets pass down and filter down towards us so that we can continue to live and breathe and have our being within this material realm. And so therefore the moon really represents a filtration system of sorts that filters all of the cosmic raw potential and powers that come from the other planets within the Chaldean order. And if we include Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, we can even include planets beyond the Chaldean order. And the moon filters this astral nutrition, as it were, and makes it digestible so that we can use that astral nutrition as a means of further feeding and sustaining our human life. So this idea of the astrological moon is very profound, and it's very rich, and it's very insightful the more we study the moon, not just from an astrological perspective, but from a mythological perspective, from a hermetic perspective, from an alchemical perspective, from the larger perspective of the Western mystery tradition. The more we realize how dependent and how reliant we are on the moon for our survival. Which brings us to another point. And that other point is that within the context of the Western mystery tradition, the moon has always held the signification as being mother. And I'm a movie person. As many people know, a lot of my cultural references come from movies. And there was a movie that I watched once, and I don't remember if it was Silent Hill or something else. I'm also a horror movie person. We all have our sufferings. I like horror movies. So anyway, there was this scene, I think it was in Silent Hill, where at the end of the movie, someone said to the main character that mother is God within the eyes of her child. And that stuck with me as a teenager up until this moment that I'm sharing it with you right now, because to a very large degree, the moon representing our mother represents our first true contact point with divinity from the perspective of our earth-based experience. So from an astrological perspective, the moon is our universal mother. And so much of our astrology begins first through an acknowledgement of the moon. The Thema Mundi, for example, which is our imaginary chart of the birth of the world, it starts with Cancer on the cusp of the Ascendant. Now, we know that from a traditional astrological perspective, the Ascendant represents that which ties the soul down. The Ascendant is the person. The Ascendant is the body. The Ascendant is the thoughts, the emotions, the internal motivating factors that causes a person to be who they are. And in the birth chart of our universe, in the birth chart of our material realm, we have Cancer on the Ascendant. So there's this understanding from even the most ancient of Western systems of astrology that the moon really is the central crux around which we build our understanding of reality. Because from an earth-based perspective, the moon is really our first true contact point with the planetary spheres. So the moon holds this utmost level of importance within our traditional astrological framework. Once again, the moon is symbolizing our universal mother, but the moon also symbolizes our mother in an actual 3D physical reality. To this point that the moon symbolizes the mother, I think I should say that when I'm practicing traditional astrology, I am far more inclined to use the moon to signify the mother than I'm inclined to use the sun to signify the father. Jean-Baptiste Morin du Villefranche, who was a 17th century astrologer, mathematician, and doctor, he made this argument in his encyclopedic work, Astrologia Gallica. And he says that this idea of overloading the planets with universal significations, it leads us down a very slippery slope. And what he basically says is that when we take a look at the sun for the purpose of delineating what the sun represents, if we look at traditional astrology, the sun represents our father, our king, our boss, our husband, and our physical bodies, basically. So if we were to use the sun to represent all of these things, Morin argues, what happens when we have a robust sense of physical health, an awful boss, a king who died early, and a father who we hate? What happens when the various things that a planet specifically represents all seem to contradict each other? It's a very good point. And he went on to speak about the moon. And he said the moon is supposed to represent our daughters and our wives and our maidservants and our mother and our grandmother and all of these things. So, what happens if we have a daughter who ran away, a maidservant who we love, a wife who we can't stand, and a mother who we never knew? How then do we use the moon as a means of representing all of these universal concepts? It's a very good traditional astrological argument. And for him, this is why the houses held such a strong level of supremacy from a traditional astrological perspective. Now, I personally believe this to be true as well, to a point. Within the context of traditional concrete event-based astrology, using the houses to delineate the various topics of a person's life is often my first recourse before I start looking at the planets as universal significators. However, the sun, in my experience, tends to be a little bit of a slippery slope as far as the delineation of a person's father is concerned. However, the moon seems to be a much more certain gauge for how a person's mother manifests within their lives. So, when I'm delineating the father, I delineate the father by assessing the ruler of the fourth house, planets in the fourth house as well. If I want to get very fancy, maybe I even delineate the first triplicity ruler of the fourth house, since we know that the first triplicity ruler of the fourth house represents the father. And as my very last recourse in the entire existence of the universe, only then, after I've done those previous things, do I take a look at the sun to see whether or not the sun has the ability to corroborate the things that I've previously said. Similarly, when I'm taking a look at the mother, I take a look at the ruler of the 10th house. I do not look at planets within the 10th house because planets within the 10th house pertain far more to a person's career than they do to a person's mother. So, the ruler of the fourth house is your father, and planets within the fourth house describe your family in general, but they can also be descriptive of your father. The ruler of your 10th house is your mother, but planets within the 10th house are not your mother because planets within the 10th house more specifically pertain to your career. This is a distinction that I don't really see anybody making within any school of astrology, and it's a distinction that becomes very important, especially if you're going to do something like a blind chart reading. You need to know how to differentiate between the ruler of the 10th house as representing mother and the planets in the 10th house as representing career. Now, the final thing that I do, fine, if I want to be fancy, maybe I assess the first triplicity ruler of the 10th house, since we know that that also represents the mother. But I also take a look at the moon. And whereas I look at the sun to represent the father, kind of like a last resort, when it comes to looking at the moon to represent the mother and the family in general, I'm more prone to look at the moon first because the moon seems to be able to carry the story of our mother and our family in general far better than the sun has the ability to carry the story of our fathers. So, with that being said, we're going to be taking a look at the moon today from the perspective of the moon as mother. On the one hand, there's another perspective that people look at the moon from, which is the moon as our emotional state. Now, as many of you know, I'm not a very emotional person. Actually, I'm an exceptionally emotional person. One would even call me an emotional wreck. However, when it comes to astrology, I don't tend to gravitate towards an astrology of emotions because that's just never been my shtick in life. I like an astrology of concrete events because for me, that is how we prove astrology, that's how we demonstrate astrology, and an astrology of emotions tends to be very nebulous and nondescript, and it's very hard to pin down the accuracy of an emotion-based sort of system of astrology. That's just me. I'm not the only astrological voice in the world, but in general, I tend to focus on an astrology of concrete events because for me, that's where the money is. So we have this concept that the moon also represents the emotions, and I believe that that is true as well. It's just not something that I tend to centralize within my personal astrological practice. You're far more likely to see me using the moon to represent the mother, using the moon to represent the stomach, and using the moon to represent the uterus, then you're likely to see me using the moon to represent one's emotions. We all have our blind sides, and for me, a major blind side within my astrology is that I've never really made sense for an astrology where I sit down and talk to somebody about their emotions for an entire hour, because I personally tend to find that a little bit non-dimensional. So today we're going to be talking about the moon, how the moon manifests as mother, how the moon manifests psychologically, but we probably won't spend too much time there. We're going to be talking about the moon and how the moon manifests from a medical astrology perspective, and anything else I can think about to talk about the moon, we'll talk about the moon. The last thing we'll also do with the moon is I'm going to use this as my opportunity to share with you my moon Chiron research, because as a lot of you know, I have lots to say about moon Chiron. For years and years I hated Chiron, and then Chiron bulldozed into my astrological practice, and I'm not so staunch a traditional astrologer that if Chiron bulldozes into my astrological practice, I'm going to tell him to leave. So I listened and I learned from Chiron for several years, and I have some stuff to share with you about the moon Chiron. Anyway, I'm having this moment of deja vu right now, which is something that happens every now and again where I could feel within my spirit that I had a dream of this exact moment before, and I'm kind of getting goosebumps because it feels like a fulfillment of my natal promise to be telling you all what I'm saying to you right now. So let's dive in. So the very first thing is that the moon by herself is representing women from a universal perspective. And we already spoke about that. The moon represents women. The moon represents our mother. The moon represents the nutritional value that we get from being mothered. So as a result of that, the moon also has a direct relationship to our gut. When we think about mother, we think about someone who's going to feed us, somebody who's going to breastfeed us, because traditionally speaking, our mother's breast milk was our very first contact point with motherhood and with food in general. So this idea of the mother's breast milk being our first food also corresponds with the stomach within our human body. And the shape of the moon also looks like the stomach in a sense in our human bodies. And as a result of that, the moon also has to do with the stomach, but the moon also has to do with the gut in general. But if we had to pinpoint a specific part of the body that corresponds with the moon has to do with the stomach. The moon also has to do with the womb. They even sound alike. Womb, moon. The moon also has to do with the womb, and therefore the moon can also be used as a gauge of fertility potential. The moon can also be used to give us insight into the menstrual cycle in general. And the moon can also be used and should be used from the perspective of any amount of female reproductive health issues, as well as from the perspective of pregnancy in general. So we use the moon for all of these things. Now, traditionally speaking, the moon was also thought to be associated with the brain because of how the brain looks and because of how the moon looks, basically. So the moon was also thought to be associated with the brain as well, or with the vegetative part of all of us, the part of all of us that grows, the part of all of us that responds to environmental change, the way in which we psychologically have to adapt ourselves as growing animals. The moon represents those things. Within the medical astrological perspective, the moon represents the physiological operations of our bodies, whereas the sun represents the external physical operations of our bodies. The moon represents the internal physiological operations of our bodies. When I have to describe this to people, I describe the sun as representing the exterior of our cars and the moon as representing the engine within that car. You could have a beautiful car and no engine, and that car will take you nowhere very quickly. Or you can have an ugly car with a wonderful engine, and that car will take you everywhere you have to go around the world. My father used to pick me up from school in his atrocious white van. And by atrocious white van, I mean, it didn't even look like one of those ominous, scary white vans that you see in the horror movies. It was just an ugly, debilitated white van. And I was so sad every time he would come. He would park underneath the tree by the school gate, and I would have to do this walk of shame from my classroom to my father's atrocious white van. And it took a while to start up. So he'd have to come out of the car. Thousands of school children were around watching my father turn on the car. Needless to say, I have paternal trauma from my father picking me up in this van. Anyway, the point is, it was a wonderful van. He had it for years and years and years, and it never broke down. It took a while to start, but once you got it started, it kept on going. So the moon represents that part of us that is more associated with the internal things that we need for health, as opposed to the external vision of us being in a radiant state of health. Because if your physiological health isn't well, then it doesn't matter if you have the body of a bodybuilder or a professional athlete or whatever. The reality is that it's what's going on underneath the hood that's actually important and that actually has the ability to support your vitality for the long run. So that's what the moon is representing, our physiological health processes. There's this idea that the moon also has to do with our wives. I don't believe that I've found that to be specifically true. However, as we go through the combinations, I'll tell you how I feel about the moon as wife concept, because sometimes it can be true, but I'll tell you exactly how it's shown up for me within the context of my practice. So that's the moon by herself. Next, we have the moon Aries combination. For those of you who don't know, the Aries point is what we refer to as 0 degrees of all of the cardinal signs collectively. Technically speaking, the next thing that we should talk about within this series of planetary pairs actually is not the Aries point, because technically speaking, the next topic would be the Ascendant, planetary pairs with the Ascendant, then the node, the moon's node, planetary pairs with the node, and then the Aries point is technically the very last thing we should talk about. Someone recently commented that they don't understand what I mean when I say the Aries point, and it's confusing for them. And I feel as if I've been pretty clear about it, but I will say it again. The Aries point is a name that we give to 0 degrees of all of the cardinal signs collectively. We could very well have called it the Cancer point, or the Libra point, or the Capricorn point, but we call it the Aries point. So when we view the cardinal axis of 0 degrees of all of the cardinal signs, we call that the cardinal cross, or we call it the Aries point, or we call it the world axis. Please don't allow your consciousness to be burdened by this idea that the Aries point has something to do with the fiery, independent, action-oriented, self-motivated nature of the sign of the zodiac Aries, because you're going to go down the wrong path. I'm not a sign-based person. So when I say the Aries point, I'm not referring to characteristics that specifically pertain to the sign of Aries. I'm referring to a name that those of us who practice Uranian astrology have given to 0 degrees of all of the cardinal signs and all hard aspects to 0 degrees of all of the cardinal signs, which, when we practice Uranian astrology, we use a much larger suite of hard aspects, because we're not just using the conjunction, the square, and the opposition, but we're also using the semi-square, the sesquiquadrate, a half of a semi-square, a half of that, and then a half of that. So the reality is that when we refer to the Aries point, yes, we are referring to 0 degrees of all the cardinal signs. However, we're also referring to all of these smaller divisions of the zodiac. A half of a square is 45 degrees. A half of 45 degrees is 22 and a half. A half of 22 and a half is 11 and a quarter. A half of 11 and a quarter is 5 degrees, 37 minutes, and 30 seconds. So the reality is that all of these constitute hard aspects within Uranian astrology. And for us, if you have anything that's occupying any of these hard aspects, we as Uranian astrologers would say that you have that thing standing on the Aries point, or you have that thing resonating with the world axis. If that feels like too much to digest at this moment, I really can't say it any more clearly until I specifically talk about the cardinal axis as its own thing, which is a few weeks from now. So stay tuned, subscribe to the Oraculos Podcast. Or if you've already understood what I said based on what I just said, then still stay tuned and still subscribe to the Oraculos Podcast. So the reality is that's what we view as the Aries point. So What does this Aries point mean? It means our connection to the world at large. The Aries point doesn't belong to any of us. The cardinal axis doesn't belong to any of us. In the same way, our midheaven belongs to us specifically. Our ascendant belongs to us specifically, because those are specific things that define the parameters of our birth chart. But the Aries point doesn't belong to any of us. The Aries point is a global factor. Therefore, we call the Aries point the world axis. Therefore, if you have a planet that's on the Aries point, that's more than likely going to be a part of your constitution astrologically that's connected to the world at large. If you have the moon on the Aries point, chances are within your world at large, you're surrounded by women, or you grew up in an environment surrounded by women, or women represent your primary clients, or women represent the fullness of your idea of your working community, or you do work that specifically impacts women, or something to that effect. Or it could highlight the presence of your mother and your mother's line and lineage of family within your life. If you have Mercury on the Aries point, then you're connected to the world at large by virtue of your intellect, your mind, your brain. You're probably a writer. You're probably somebody who is in a communicative field. You probably have a degree in mass communication. You probably work in journalism. You're probably someone who is working in a very transactional way with the world around you. You're probably working in public speaking. You have Venus on the Aries point. You're probably an artist. You're probably working in an artistic community. You're probably working in the beauty industry, whether you are a graphic designer, an interior designer, a hair designer, a face designer, any type of designer. It could be you. So the reality is that the Aries point represents to a very large degree how many of us find ourselves connecting and being plugged into the world at large. And that's all I'm going to say about that, because this isn't the Aries point week. The point of the matter is, moon on the Aries point, I work with women. Women are a very major part of my community. I'm working within a field or an industry that directly impacts the lives of women. They represent my primary clientele. My mother was a very huge factor within my life. I could also be working in a lunar profession, or I could also be connected to the world in a lunar way. People look at me and they call me mother. Even if I'm a man, they look at me and they feel a sense of maternal protection. People come to my house to get fed. I might be a chef working in the food and beverage industry where I'm feeding people, because that's also representing a lunar profession in general. Whenever we have a planet on the Aries point, that's essentially the same as having that planet strongly angular within our chart. With the exception of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, because none of us own Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto in a personal way. So Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, Chiron, Maki Maki, Hayamea, Scooby-Dooby-Doo, all of these planets that we don't have from a traditional astrological perspective as specifically being the rulers of houses or the rulers of signs, those planets don't specifically have a direct connection to us in the same way as Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon have a direct connection to us. So that's something worth knowing. So that's the Aries point. It definitely is kind of feeling like I haven't done a very dimensional job at it. But the reality is that the Aries point and the moon both are reflective things within our astrology. When it comes to astrology, there are certain things that reflect the relationship that they have to other things around us. For example, the apart to fortune means nothing independently by itself from a planet to planet based perspective. We know that within a traditional context, the apart to fortune represents our wealth. However, when we extricate ourselves from specifically practicing traditional astrology, the part of fortune by itself doesn't really mean anything in a very personal sort of way, because it only means something if it's connected to a planet. So if you have the part of fortune connected to Mercury, you love mercurial things, you make money from mercurial things, you're a heavily mercurial person, you love Mercury. If you have the part of fortune connected to Venus, you love Venusian things, you love artistry and painting and design and all of these things, you're a Venusian person. If you have Saturn connected to the part of fortune, you love Saturnian things, you're a very responsible person. People look at you and they throw all their burdens on your shoulders. You probably love working with the earth, or you probably love working with the government because you want to be a part of a system that's much bigger than you because you're a Saturnian person. The reality is that the part of fortune is one of these reflective things within our chart that doesn't mean anything independent of its connections to other things. The midheaven, the sun, the moon, the ascendant, the node, and the Aries point, all of these things are reflective things within our charts that don't really mean anything specifically from a planet to planet based perspective. Sure, we know they mean a lot from a traditional astrology perspective, but when we're only talking about planets based on their interaction with other planets, these things technically don't mean anything by themselves. They have to be brought into connection with other planets. So if you have Moon Aries, Moon on the Aries point being squared by Saturn, you probably serve underprivileged women within your work. Whereas if you have Moon on the Aries point squared by Jupiter, you probably serve wealthy women within the context of the work that you do. So we need the other planets always to be descriptors or to give us information when we have these sorts of planetary combinations. On this note, I do think that it's important to let you all know that thus far we have covered the 3 interpersonal points in Uranian astrology. Because a few weeks ago, I posted the video of aspects to the midheaven. Then I posted the video of aspects to the sun, and now this is your lecture on aspects to the moon. These 3 astrological factors, the midheaven, the sun, and the moon, represent the most personal points within Uranian astrology, and they represent the interpersonal points within Uranian astrology. Whereas the last 3 personal points, the ascendant, the node, and the Aries point, represent our outer personal points within Uranian astrology because they connect us to the outer world beyond our interior sphere. So we're talking about the moon. The moon is a very internal personal point, and we're going to continue to dive deeper into the subject. Now, the next thing that we have is moon midheaven. Moon midheaven, as far as I'm concerned, simply means my mother. Now, if you're a person who has the moon conjunct the midheaven, square the midheaven, hard aspect the midheaven, hallelujah the midheaven, anything with the midheaven at all, you might find yourself in a very maternal field. And a student of mine recently pointed out the fact that therapy can also be a maternal field. You might be a chef, you might be a babysitter, you might be a gardener, you like to take care of plants, you might find a way to turn things within your world into your children. Whether or not you actually have children, you might work with young children, you might work within a pediatric industry, you might work in the food industry because once again the moon has to do with feeding. You could work in any of these fields where you find yourself being a caretaker or extending yourself in order to be of support, of assistance, of care to others around you. All of these things are lunar industries. Now, if we were exploring this from the perspective of Uranian astrology, then we could use moon midheaven as a specific significator of our mother, because we get the word my from the midheaven and we get the word mother from the moon. So moon midheaven could be one of the midpoints that we look for from the perspective of my mother specifically. And if you are familiar with how to use midpoints, then go and take a look at your own moon midheaven midpoint and see whether or not the planets that are on your moon midheaven midpoint are descriptive of either your mother or your relationship with your mother specifically. The next combination we have is the moon ascendant. Very often when people have the moon conjunct their ascendant, that can represent people who, once again, grew up in a household or who grew up in an environment that was very much their mother's home, or that was very much a space where their mother held sway, or they could have grown up with a grandmother, or they could have grown up with their aunts, or they could have grown up in a household full of sisters. But there could be a very strong emphasis of women within their early childhood environment because the ascendant is having to do with our early childhood environment. So very often when people have the moon conjunct their ascendant or the moon rising in their chart, it can represent this very strong presence of their mother or their mother's family or their mother's story within their lives in general. Now, once again, this is a pretty wide open statement, and we would need to see other things that are directly in aspect to the moon and to their ascendant in order to flesh that out a bit more. But in general, moon ascendant has to do with acquaintances, with women, it has to do with the women within our immediate environment, and it has to do with the impact that our mother has on our environment as well. And that's all I really have to say about that. Sorry if that's a little bit lackluster, but we definitely want to see other things in order to give us more insight into what's going on. Because if you have the moon conjunct your ascendant or the moon in hard aspect to your ascendant in any way whatsoever, and that is picking up the hard aspect of Jupiter, for example, then you probably came from a lovely environment with lovely women who treated you well, who nurtured you, who mothered you, who made you feel like you were worth $1 million. Whereas if we have moon ascendant and that's in a hard aspect with Pluto, or that's in a hard aspect with Mars, or that's in a hard aspect with another malefic planet, then the story of women within our environment could have been a very potently challenging or a very potently difficult part of our lives in general. So that's the moon ascendant. Now we go on to the sun moon. Technically, this webinar should be shorter than the previous webinars because we've already gone through the midheaven combination with the moon, the sun combination with the moon, but I'm a sucker for punishment, so I'm going to talk about the sun-moon midpoint one more time just in case you missed it from the first broadcast. But you could definitely listen to the first webinar about the sun in which you'll learn all about the sun-moon midpoint. The sun-moon midpoint for a lot of people means a lot of things, but for me it means marriage. Whenever I'm looking at a person's chart and I want to see what their destiny as it relates to their love life is concerned, I always explore the sun-moon midpoint. Other people who are far more psychologically, astrologically aligned than myself will look at the sun-moon midpoint as the full, what things do people say? I don't even know. As the full culmination of who that person is, because the sun represents the self and the moon represents the emotions. Therefore, the sun-moon midpoint is going to represent the full culmination of who you are as a person. That is a very nice concept. It's a very cute concept. And as far as that's concerned, I don't have a dog in that fight. Because the reality is that I don't use it in that way. And that's all I have to say about it, which doesn't mean that it isn't accurate or it isn't valid. It just means that within my practice of concrete event-based astrology, what I have observed is that the sun-moon midpoint has far more to do with the nature of a person's romantic life, their love life, than it has to do with the full culmination of their self and their emotions and blah, 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 and all of the things that people say. And I don't mean blah, blah, blah as a means of being dismissive. I mean blah, blah, blah as this is yet again another hole within my own personal astrological situation, because I tend to be very one-tracked in terms of the things that I do. And I only use the sun-moon midpoint to represent a person's marital partner. Planets that we find on the sun-moon midpoint are going to be very descriptive of a person's marital partner, and they're also going to be very descriptive of the way how the topic of romance manifests within that person's life in general. If you want to hear more about what I have to say about the sun and moon, then by all means, please do listen to the last recording of planetary pairs in which I talk all about how, traditionally speaking, the sun and moon in hard aspect from a traditional astrological perspective can sometimes have to do with contentious relationships between our parents. And I also speak about how the quincunx between the sun and the moon is the worst type of contentious relationship that can potentially manifest between our parents. So if you want to know more about the sun-moon combination, then definitely go and check out the last recording in this planetary pairs series. Now, moving on to the moon node, we're getting rid of all of the things that are simply mirrors of the environment. And so here we have the moon node combination, which is another mirror of the environment. The moon node combination has to do with our intimate connections with women. And I think it stands to reason that within the chart of a heterosexual man, this is something that could be explored from the perspective of his intimate connections with women in the form of his wife. However, it isn't something that I've ever done before. So, moon node has to do with our intimate connections with women. If you have the moon in a conjunction with your north node from a traditional astrological perspective, it increases the maternal presence within your life. If you have the moon south node, the moon conjunct the south node from a traditional astrological perspective, one, it can indicate issues with the parts of the body that we associate with the moon, such as the stomach and the female reproductive system in general, but it can also indicate a challenging relationship with the mother or the absentee mother or the mother who wasn't present for the child. Now, I said this in a forecast a couple weeks ago, and somebody got very offended by the fact that I said this because she said that her child has moon conjunct the south node, and she felt awful about hearing what I said about the moon south node and all sorts of stuff. The reality is, as professional astrologers, we cannot look at just one thing and use that to base an entire judgment on. So, what I'm giving you within either the forecast that we do at the Oraculos School of Astrology or even this sort of planetary pairs lecture that I'm giving is I'm giving you basically a dictionary of information. However, we know that even within a dictionary, certain things aren't relevant unless they're brought into conversation with other ideas or concepts. So I'm just listing out the dictionary version of what it means to have a moon node contact. As intelligent professional astrologers, you have to know that if I say moon conjunct the south node means that you're going to have stomach problems, you need to know that that's what that means independently, universally, but in order to actually say that to someone, you have to find multiple other corroborating factors that support that statement. Astrology is not a one statement sort of business, and very often when we try to make a one statement as a universal statement, such as here are 3 things to improve your sex life if you're a Leo, then you oftentimes end up shooting yourself in the foot, because there cannot be 3 things to improve your sex life as a Leo, because that is just one part of that person's constitution. And collectively, we need to move towards a more intelligent version of astrology. So it is my hope that as I give you all of this free content, that you actually listen to it within the context of a much larger astrological practice. Within any astrological practice, corroboration has to be your favorite word. And corroboration means that you're not just going to make a judgment of what you see in the chart based on seeing one thing that says that thing. You have to see 3 things, 4 things, 5 things that all stand in supporting what you're trying to say, because one thing just doesn't cut it. So anyway, I've said this already earlier this week, and I'm saying it again because I want to believe that I am training our audience here at the Oraculos School of Astrology to practice more intelligent astrology. And you're not practicing intelligent astrology if you're only taking one concept and using that as a blanket statement for the entirety of what's occurring within your chart. If you're a bad parent, chances are that shows up within your child's chart in multiple ways, but it's not just going to be one thing that demonstrates that. So moving on. The next thing that we have is the moon node combination. I just gave you my thoughts about the moon node. Once again, the moon and the node are 2 mirrors, and so we want to see what those mirrors are connecting with in order to have a more nuanced thing to say about them. But in general, moon node has to do with our intimate connections with women specifically. Moving into moon Mercury. Now, moon Mercury has to do with the motions of the mind and the motions of the brain. There's this traditional astrological thought that if a person had the moon afflicting Mercury, then that could indicate that that person had no intelligence or no mental sobriety, because that person lived a life in which their heart and their emotional constitution and their animal nature always got in the way of their humane faculties. So, Moon, Mercury in hard aspect combinations, traditionally speaking, was something that they looked at as a means of a person having a very real schism or a very real disconnect between the emotional content of who they were and the psychological content of who they were. And that can cause a person to, yes, have thoughts that are very deeply emotionally informed, but it could also cause a person to have a thinking process that's constantly interfered with their larger emotional tides and tendencies within themselves. So that's the traditional definition of the Moon Mercury combination. I personally do not believe that Moon Mercury or even Venus Mercury stand to reflect or describe our mother. And I don't really know why that is. It's probably in the same way how I don't believe that Sun Moon stands to describe our mother specifically. As far as combinations that describe the mother are concerned, I believe those combinations start from Mars. Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Chiron, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. So the Moon Mercury piece that I'm saying right now doesn't necessarily describe those things. Now, when a person has Moon Mercury, sometimes that person can be very high strung emotionally, and sometimes that person can be in a state of constant fluctuation from a thought process. Now, this can do several things in terms of how a person is functioning mentally within the world. Maybe it causes them to have poor memory because their mind is constantly fluctuating through bits and pieces of information that they can't really hold everything in the container. It could be like trying to stuff frogs in a tube or something where as you put one frog in, another frog jumps out. So that could kind of be the sort of mentality of a person like this, where their mind is very sharp, but it's also moving very quickly. And they have the monkey brain, as it were, where they can't really keep themselves focused in a very specific sort of way. So that could be how the Moon Mercury is manifesting. Moon Mercury can also give a person a very deep imaginative power. And I think the imaginative power also comes from this idea of the jumping mind, because the mind that jumps is the mind that's in a constant state of stimulation. And if the mind is in a constant state of stimulation, then chances are the mind is picking up on things that it probably would not have picked up on if it were just operating at a regular, normal pace or speed. So this also has to do with the imaginative power. And so people who have this could be daydreamers, or they could be people who are fundamentally very imaginative and they're able to come up with solutions or come up with ideas because they have this feedback loop between the subconscious part of themselves, which the moon represents to a very large degree, but also the conscious part of themselves, which is what Mercury represents to a very large degree. Now, I've often said that Moon and Mercury together in a hard aspect combination represents the lungs and the respiratory system specifically. Very often when we find a person who has asthma or who constantly gets pneumonia within their lives, or who have other forms of respiratory weakness, we can oftentimes find Moon Mercury within their charts being squared by Saturn, or Moon Mercury within their charts being squared by Neptune, because that combination has to do with the weakened respiratory capacity. Now, moving on to Moon Venus. I love Moon Venus because Moon Venus has to do with our ability to conceive, our ability to procreate. Moon Venus has to do with our ability to get pregnant. So the Moon Venus midpoint is the specific midpoint of motherhood and pregnancy within the context of cosmobiology. As we know, cosmobiology is basically a quick and dirty way of practicing Uranian astrology, because cosmobiology simplified a lot of Uranian astrology to a very large degree, and it primarily focuses on midpoints. So the Moon Venus midpoint is a very potent midpoint for us to explore from the perspective of motherhood, conception, pregnancy, our ability to be a mother, our ability to not be a mother. All of these things we look at from the Moon Venus midpoint. We also look at the Moon Venus midpoint when it comes to us assessing various female reproductive health concerns. Because if the Moon Venus has to do with motherhood in general, then the Moon Venus midpoint will also point towards the uterus, the ovaries, and all the parts of our constitution that specifically impact our ability to be mothers, or a woman's ability to function as far as the female reproductive system is concerned. So these are some of the things that we find with this combination. Now, Moon Venus also has to do with a person who knows how to schmooze, a person who knows how to wine and dine and make people feel loved and cared for. A Moon Venus person is a person who's a bit of a socialite. They love to connect with people. They love to be in exchange with people. They love the joy of connecting and sharing and expressing themselves within a public capacity. They love cooking, and they love, well, not necessarily cooking, but they love eating, and they love going out, and they love restaurants, and they love that type of social exchange that comes from being around people in delightful spaces. Moon Venus can also give a person a sweet tooth. So it is something that we want to be mindful of looking at, especially if a person has something like a Moon in a square relationship with Venus, and that is afflicted by Pluto, or that's afflicted by Jupiter, or that's afflicted by something else. Moon Venus can give somebody a sweet tooth, which means Moon Venus is one of the things that we can look at from the perspective of diabetes, but it's also something that we can look at from the perspective of the sugar content of a person's body and their ability to process sugar in general. So Moon Venus is a very nuanced combination. However, the one takeaway of the Moon Venus is that Moon Venus people tend to be people who have the ability to smooth the path between people, and they want to create warm, inviting, succulent experiences for other people to be a part of. They want to enjoy public space and public settings in a way that feels nice and in a way that feels good. And they're very good at the schmoozing, and they're very good at the wining and dining, and they're just very good at creating a warm environment for people to belong to in general. Moon Venus, the last thing I'll say about this is that the Moon Venus combination also is a combination for motherhood, particularly the Moon Venus midpoint. And so if you want to explore the story of motherhood within your life, then you definitely want to explore the Moon Venus midpoint. Now to the combinations that I think specifically have to do with our own mother. And fine, maybe if I were to use the Moon Mercury to represent a person's mother, that could represent your very intelligent, quick-speaking mother. And if I had to use Moon Venus to represent your mother, then maybe that would represent your artistic, beautiful mother. However, I'm less inclined to do that. So if you have Moon Mercury in your chart and you feel as if it's descriptive of your mother, then let us know down below in the comment section. Also, if you have Moon Venus in your chart and you similarly think that that is descriptive of your maternal connection, and maybe your mother was an artist or a beautician or something to that effect, then also let us know down below in the comment section so that we can learn, and so that I can learn, and so that we all practice better astrology. And also, if you don't think it's descriptive of your mother at all, but you do know that it shows up within your life in a very specific and profound way, then also let us know down below in the comment section. Now, moving on, Moon Mars. Whenever I see a woman who has Moon Mars within her chart, 8 times out of 10, she herself can be a very fiery woman. And what does that even mean, fiery woman? What it means is very often when women have the Moon Mars within their chart, they go to the gym and they do high intensity interval training, and they love to work out, and they love to go mountain climbing, and they love to go paddle boarding, and well, not paddle boarding because that's too mild. They love to go rowing down Lake Charles or whatever. They love to do things that are very active, action oriented, And that, in the far distant past, wouldn't necessarily be considered to be quote unquote feminine activities. They love to live a life of activity and they love to work. There is this very real association to work within the charts of women who have Moon, Mars in hard aspect combination. Now, a part of where this comes from, this desire to be an independent woman, this desire to be independent in general, this desire to be action oriented and somebody who's calling the shots in general could be because that is the influence that their mother had on their own household and home. Maybe they came from a household and home where their mother didn't really know how to slow down and step into a role of genuine motherhood. Maybe they came from a household and home in which they felt as if their mother was a very hot and fiery person who didn't have the ability to really step into a role of warm, moist motherhood. And maybe that person fundamentally felt as if she had to take care of herself. Maybe she felt as if she didn't really have any other evidence of what it was like to be a woman within her lifetime other than to be a hard-working, action-oriented, taking the bull by the horns sort of person. Within the charts of men, how this tends to manifest is in terms of their mother specifically, and this sometimes manifests in terms of the women who they find themselves attracted to if we're referring to the chart of a heterosexual man. So very often, within the chart of a heterosexual man, having the moon in a hard aspect relationship with Mars can indicate that they have a very hot-headed mother, and subsequently they have a very hot-headed wife who calls all the shots, who's the ruler of the roost, and who really is representing this major source of firepower within his own life. And sometimes that can be good from the perspective of the wife being the one who's making the money, or the wife being the one who is making sure that the things are getting done in the home, or the wife being the one who is fundamentally in charge of the household. And sometimes it can also create an environment where that becomes a very overbearing thing, and where the women within his life become very overbearing and they make him feel quite small and they make him feel very emasculated as a result of how they're showing up. So these are two of the things we can sometimes see. I once heard someone describe this as being the man who was, and I don't even want to say that because I don't need to be canceled and I don't need for people to take things that I say out of context. But I once heard someone say that this can be described as the man who felt less masculine growing up because as a young boy, he was taken advantage of by a woman. So the woman was the aggressor within his life. And that's the PG-13 way of saying that. So the reality is this can be a thing where it feels as if the firepower or the masculine drive within my life as a man comes from the women within my life, and I defer that power to them because I find it difficult to really access that within myself. So that's another way how this shows up. Another way how this shows up from a medical astrology perspective is a person who has a very acidic constitution in general. And this could be the case for men and women, where we have the moon Mars representing a sense of a very acidic digestive system, and sometimes these people can have gastroesophageal reflux disorder, which is acid reflux, because that's just something that they live with. This is also a combination that we find within the charts of people who love hot, spicy foods. Moon Mars people tend to love hot, spicy foods, and it also tends to be the worst thing for them. Moon Mars people also love coffee, and that also tends to be the worst thing for them. Moon Mars people also love alcohol, and that also tends to be the worst thing for them. I think when it comes to food consumption, Moon Mars people tend to gravitate towards foods that have a corrosive effect on the body, whether that's eating hot chili Cheetos, or whether that is drinking hot sauce, or whether that is drinking too much coffee, or whether that is drinking too much alcohol. Moon Mars is a very interesting combination from the perspective of our health, And if you're a Moon Mars person, chances are you should stay away from all of those things. However, if you're a Moon Mars person, chances are you're willing to stay away from all of those things, with the exception of coffee, because there's just something about Moon Mars people and coffee that seems rather ridiculous from my perspective. But once again, I'm not the Moon Mars person in this conversation. So those are the ways how Moon Mars can manifest, but it can really be taxing on the digestive system as a result of the ways in which those things just don't jive well with their physical constitution. I think another thing that Moon Mars people tend to have is a very fast metabolic rate, and so the food enters them and the food goes out of them sometimes. Now, clearly, if you're a person who has Moon Mars in a hard aspect relationship, but Jupiter conjunct your ascendant, then it doesn't matter how fast your metabolic rate is, you still probably will have a larger physical body in this lifetime, because these are the ways how these concepts get nuanced. But the reality is that Moon Mars tends to give a person a faster metabolic rate, where it feels like they just inhale the food and the food is gone and then they're hungry 2 seconds later. So that's something that we also find with Moon Mars people. I think Moon Mars people also do well from the perspective of meat consumption. Now, I'm a vegetarian. I can't stand the smell of meat, the taste of meat, the look of meat, and I've recently basically become a vegan because cheese, even though I love it, isn't really the best thing in the world for me. And that's not because of religious reasons. My reason for being a vegetarian is just because as a child, I've always hated the smell of meat, and particularly the aftertaste of meat is just awful. So I don't eat meat at all. However, if I were a Moon Mars person, I would probably feel the need to consume flesh. There's also been a tiny bit of research, and I think it's still quite anecdotal, about Moon Mars and anemia specifically, or Moon Mars and iron deficiencies. And so sometimes people do need to eat meat as a means of bolstering that part of themselves as well. So these are some of the ways how we see the Moon Mars manifesting in general. It's a very hot, hot, hot combination. It could give you a very hot, hot and heated mother, and it can make you feel as if, as a result of your mother's example, if you're a woman, you have to also go out and be the hunter-gatherer for your family. And if you're a guy, this might just be the sort of women you find yourself gravitating towards in your life in general. And these are some of the ways how the Moon-Mars combination manifests, both within us as well as from the perspective of our digestive system. Moon Mars is also something we find within the charts of people who are very athletic. And it doesn't matter who you are. You could have Moon Mars and be a guy and be a very athletic person in general. But more often than not, Moon Mars within the charts of women make them very athletic. And I dare say competitive, because you don't necessarily need to be an athlete in order to be competitive. So Moon Mars is a very competitive combination as well. Action-oriented, assertive, all of these wonderful Martian words. Now, moving on through oy vey, some things I didn't say about the Moon Mars. See, I told you as we get into these planets that have more of a richer texture or color, we'll have more things to say. There is this quote by Dorotheus of Sidon that says that women who have the hard aspect of Moon and Mars have to carve the baby out of their womb. Wow. Powerful language, very vivid imagery. And I've sat with this and I've thought about this for a very long time. What could that possibly mean in the 21st century to have to carve the baby out of the womb? Now, the next thing I'm going to say, I think that I've said often enough to not take things out of context and to say that I'm providing this information from an informational, educational perspective so that you can have some insights into these combinations. But I could feel within my gut of guts that the next thing I'm going to say is probably going to be taken out of context, which makes me not even want to say it. But I will say it for the sake of posterity. When it comes to Moon Mars, I've thought about what it means in terms for someone to have to carve the baby out. And actually, I don't even feel any way in saying it at all, because what I'm saying is based on my own client work. So don't shoot the messenger. Anyway, And very often, when I've spoken with women who have this combination, and not just this combination, I think that I have to keep on reiterating that, not just this combination within a much larger, difficult pregnancy natal chart, very often when they have this on top of that, it can manifest as having a stillbirth. It can manifest as having to abort a birth, not necessarily because it just wasn't the right time, but it can manifest as abortion from the perspective of it could have been life threatening. I've spoken to people about this in terms of this manifesting as C-sections. Now, if you've listened to me for longer than one episode, you probably know that as far as cesarean sections are concerned, I tend to not let that take up a big amount of my medical astrology practice or thinking because very often, and not very often, but because today within the 21st century, we find C-sections being prescribed with greater frequency, I think, even than 20 years ago. So as a result of that, when something becomes so normal that it becomes standard practice, it loses its actual appeal at being interesting from an astrological perspective. So, in general, I tend not to do medical astrology research about C sections just because they become that much more normal within the 21st century. However, a student once asked me about my thought regarding the connection between these two things, and insofar as a C-section does also have to do with this idea of carving the baby out of the womb, which isn't that grotesque in the 21st century, but insofar as there is a surgical removal of the child by cutting into the lower abdomen to remove the child, then definitely I do believe that that can fall under the auspices of the moon Mars as well. Moon Mars also has to do with irregular menstruation, and not irregular menstruation, but it has to do with excess bleeding within the menstrual cycle. So Moon Mars can have to do with an excessively painful menstrual cycle. It can also have to do with excessive bleeding within the menstrual cycle. These are other ways how we can find this manifesting. I don't personally believe that Moon Mars is a signature for endometriosis, because within my own endometriosis studies, there are other things that tend to stand out more fully. However, Moon Mars definitely is standing out in terms of heavy bleeding during menstruation. It's also standing out in terms of stories of abortion where the pregnancy had to be terminated as a means of saving the life of the mother because there was some health complication. And this is also something that we're seeing manifesting in terms of some of the dietary things I made mention of before. Moving on to the next combination, we have Moon Jupiter. Moon Jupiter is a lovely combination. Moon Jupiter, very similar to Moon Venus, has to do with the person who knows how to wine and dine and schmooze and groove and make everybody feel wonderful and happy. Moon Jupiter is also a very rich food combination. So, whereas people who have Moon Venus can have a sweet tooth, people who have Moon Jupiter can just like rich, heavy, oily, greasy foods. And the reason for that is because Jupiter is corresponding with heavy, oily, greasy everything. And so, Moon Jupiter is a person who enjoys savory foods, rich foods, flavorful foods, foods that represent soul food, spirit food that you eat that fills you up, that reminds you of your whole ancestral bloodline. It's a sort of Moon Jupiter sort of thing, which is why when people have Moon Jupiter, we also want to be mindful of the ways how that could manifest from the perspective of their weight fluctuations in general, and also from the perspective of them accumulating toxins within their system that comes from eating food that is too rich and too heavy all of the time. So that's something that we're finding with Moon Jupiter from a medical astrological perspective. Moon Jupiter has to do with the wonderful mother. When you have Moon Jupiter, chances are you had a wonderful mother who everybody loved and everybody wanted her to be their mother as well. Your mother never hurt a fly. Your mother was the best thing since sliced bread, is what we oftentimes find when a person has Moon Jupiter. I once had a client who had Moon conjunct Jupiter in opposition with Pluto, and that sent me for a tailspin. And by once, I mean a month ago. And when I saw his chart, my default was to talk about the moon Pluto because I have very profound things to say about the moon Pluto. However, he said, no, my mother was none of those things. My mother was the nicest person in the world. Everybody loved her. My mother never hurt a fly. My mother is the most wonderful person you will ever meet in the entire universe. When we practice good astrology looks like us filtering down a field of 1,000 possibilities to a list of probably 10 possibilities. And excellent astrology is us whittling down that list of 10 possibilities to a list of at least 3 possibilities. And the best astrologers amongst us have the ability to whittle down a sky of 10,000 possibilities down to 2 possibilities. So I said to him all of the things I had to say about the moon Pluto and how that can manifest, from the challenges with the mother to the manipulative mother to the crazy mother to the mother who hurts me to the mother who is awful to the mother who gaslights everybody to the mother who chains me to the bed and tells me 10 years later she never did that, I made it all up. So I spoke to him about the moon Pluto from that perspective, and he said none of it was true. So after he said none of it was true, I then said, well, the only other way how I could think of this manifesting is as you possibly having very real gut health problems, and particularly gut health problems and digestive issues where you're not digesting food properly, and therefore it's creating huge problems for you when it comes to defecating and when it comes to releasing that poorly digested food from your system, and it could cause your relationship to food and digestion in general to be a very traumatic part of your life. And he said, Mychal, you nailed it. I didn't nail it. That was simply the possibilities that I could think of in that moment if the first thing that I said didn't land or didn't resonate. And I think as a thing that all of us can do as astrologers is to make sure that we have our short list of what things mean most of the times. Now, we can never say what things mean all of the times because you're not God, I'm not Jesus. We're just a bleep within the cosmic continuum of time. But the reality is that as astrologers, as good astrologers, as astrologers who have a dedication to improving the quality of our field in general, we need to be able to whittle down a list of 10,000 things into the options that we see working most of the times. And that most of the times is a very important thing. And most of the times doesn't come from somebody else's experience. Most of the times doesn't come from you listening to this webinar right now. Most of the times comes from you going out into the world and practicing astrology with real people for yourself. Because only through practicing astrology with real people will you uncover these secrets for yourself, and will you discover what most of the times means within the context of your life. Because I know what it means when people come to me when they have moon in hard aspect with Chiron most of the times. But probably that's just because the universe tends to send me those people because I have a moon Chiron story to learn within my own lifetime. I can't imagine what that story would be, but probably that's why the universe sends me those people. So the reality is that we all need to establish for ourselves what most of the times means for us so that we can practice better astrology. Moon Jupiter can also manifest in terms of there being excessive tenderness or swelling within the breasts. The reason for this is because Jupiter has to do with the process of swelling, and the moon has to do with the breasts as a larger part of the female anatomy in general. So moon Jupiter can have to do with very large breasts in general, but it can also have to do with excessive swelling in the breasts. Because Jupiter has to do with the growth of things, and oftentimes the benign growth of things, then moon Jupiter can also be a combination that we find within benign lumps that grow within the tissue of the breast specifically, or benign masses that grow within other parts of the female reproductive system. Now, moving on to moon Saturn. Moon Saturn is often representing a sense of restriction surrounding how we access nurturing within our lives. And the effect of this for a lot of people is that it creates a very real sense of pessimism, but it also creates a very real sense of depression within the lives of those people, because there can be a feeling of isolation and loneliness and being separated from people in general, or being an outcast, or not necessarily being able to connect with my community and therefore having to live on the fringes of the world. It can create this sense of being isolated, and that sense of being isolated can create a larger feeling of depression and melancholy within the life of a person. So the moon Saturn combination, it starts off as these things. It starts off with a person having a more serious outlook on life, or a person having a more serious disposition, or a person sometimes only seeing the rain cloud and not necessarily seeing the fact that the earth is parched and the earth needed that rain in order for new life to grow. So sometimes moon Saturn can feel as if a heaviness just exists over our mind and our heart in general. And for us, we might feel as if we're just being practical. For us, we might feel as if we're the people who can actually see the truth, and we're the people who can actually see the dangers that lie ahead. But for other people, it could feel as if we're being a party pooper, or as if we're raining on their parade, or as if we aren't able to just lighten up and let our hair down. So moon Saturn can create this sort of disposition in life in general. Now, from the perspective of the mother, very often moon Saturn can represent the depressed mother, the overly serious mother, the overly conservative mother, the mother who had orthodox values that didn't actually allow us to feel free or expressive as children, the mother who was overworked and underpaid, and as a result of that, didn't really have much more room left in her life to feed us her breast milk, the mother who probably couldn't even produce breast milk because she was so heavily stressed in general. Moon Saturn can manifest as the drying up of my mother's breast milk. Moon Saturn can manifest as the mother who has so many children that by the time she has me, she has no more breast milk to give. So all of these things can manifest as a moon Saturn sort of situation. Now, the moon Saturn can also make all of us feel more responsible for our surroundings in general, because I think that that is the gift of Saturn. Whenever we have Sun Saturn or Moon Saturn, we can oftentimes thrust ourselves into roles of responsibility and roles of having to take care of others. But particularly when it comes to the Moon Saturn, even more so than the Sun Saturn, we do that because that's the only way how we know how to be loved. And I think the psychology behind that is very stressful because you deserve love. You deserve love. You are a child of the universe, no less than the trees and the stars. You have a right to be here. And very often, when a person has Moon Saturn, they need to hear that. Because, boy, I didn't even know how this would hit me. And I don't even have Moon Saturn. But as I step into it, one of the things that I do as a person that I think has aided my ability to practice astrology at the level that I practice it is I have the ability to step fully into an experience, or I have the ability to step fully into an astrological combination and feel what that feels like within my soul and psyche. And it's something I try to teach my students, but I'm not even sure it's teachable. When we practice astrology, if we're going to practice great astrology, we need to be able to step into the morphic field of that thing that we're describing. And that's something that I've done always within my own astrological practice. And as I step into this morphic field of Moon Saturn, I don't want to be there. Because, wow, I've never felt this type of loneliness. I've never felt this quality of needing to do something in order to be loved. I've never felt that level of transactionality before, and it feels very heavy. It feels like a very heavy thing for somebody to have to live with. It feels like a very heavy thing to have to grow with, and it doesn't actually create the space or the freedom for a person to realize that it's okay to not do things. that it's okay to not have to show up, that it's okay to just be you, and that is all you need to be loved. So very often, Moon Saturn, I'm remembering an aphorism that says that people who have their moon in any of the domiciles of Saturn, their mother was a slave. And this is people who have their moon in Capricorn or their moon in Aquarius, but more so the moon in Capricorn. I think it was Julius Firmicus Maternus, if not Dorotheus, who says to us that when you have the moon in the domiciles of Saturn, it says that your mother was a slave. But because I'm not assigned to the zodiac type person, I do believe that when you have your moon Saturn, it says that you yourself thrust yourself into this role of slavery because you feel as if only by doing that will people respect you or appreciate you or love you or value you or honor you. So there's this sense of my ability to be honored by the world around me directly comes from how much I can do for the world around me. And that's a bit of a problem. That is very, very stressful because I'm just thinking about this further. I think that this could be the sort of thing we see manifesting within the charts of people who, let's talk about motherhood, for example, within the charts of women who, the minute their children leave home and go out into the world to go to university. Sure, I know that that can be a depressive thing for most parents, but I think that that sort of unshakable depression that comes from not making breakfast for somebody in the morning, that comes from not having to do this person's laundry, that comes from not having to take care of this person, that sort of deep depression to the point where you don't even know who you are anymore because you've become so associated with the things you do as a means of giving you value that you don't actually know how to find value within yourself apart from actually doing for others. I think that this is very descriptive of the Moon Saturn combination. It can be very, very heavy. Now, from a positive side of this, it lets us all know that we are our brother's keeper. We are our sister's keeper. It lets us know that we do have this role to play within society at large, period. And I think that that's the best part of this because it gives us the ability to work. I'm not even sure if that's true because sometimes the sort of heaviness that the Moon Saturn person can find themselves operating under can be heaviness to the point of them feeling immobilized or to the point of them feeling as if they can't even wake up in the morning. They just want to stay in bed because the whole world feels so heavy. Everything feels so heavy. It feels like it's crashing down on their shoulders. So you could feel as if you're carrying the burden of doing work even when you're just laying down in bed, unable to go to work. The point of the matter is that Moon Saturn is a tricky combination. It's a heavy combination. It's a lonely combination. It could be a wonderful thing if you're working in isolation. So if you're a person working in research or you're working in isolation or something to that effect, then it can be great. It can also be great if you are a school teacher, I guess. If you're teaching young children and you have Moon Saturn, and so there's this constant maternal wound of getting close to children and letting them go and getting close to them again and letting them go, then I think that this can be wonderful from the perspective of a person who's a school teacher. It could also probably be wonderful from the perspective of somebody working as a veterinarian where you're taking care of animals like you would take care of your children and you're holding them, rehabilitating them and letting them go. All of these things could be great from the perspective of the Moon Saturn because Moon Saturn makes you a professional caretaker. So we like it for that reason. And hopefully I've raised the vibration so that the atmosphere got lighter as a result of saying the good things about the Moon Saturn, because Moon Saturn actually is the combination of atmospheric pressure. Because remember, the moon is representing our sublunar sphere and Saturn is representing this oppressive force. So Moon Saturn is also the combination of atmospheric pressure. And maybe you're the sort of person who has arthritis or bunions where your bones speak to you whenever it's going to rain or whenever there's a change in the atmospheric pressure, your body speaks to you because you have a body that is so sensitive to pressure in general that when the air around you changes, you also feel that deeply within yourself. Now, from a medical astrology perspective, Moon Saturn can have to do with constipation because Moon Saturn can have to do with dehydration. Moon is hydration and Saturn is the D. So, Moon Saturn can have to do with dehydration as well, and it can have to do with constipation. So, if you're a person who has Moon Saturn, while I'm not an allopathic medical practitioner, and as a result of that, I shouldn't even be suggesting that you drink water, because if you're not a trained and licensed health professional, you technically can't even suggest to somebody that they drink water. However, at the risk of losing my non-existent license, people who have Moon Saturn, they need to find ways to stay hydrated in general. And whatever you do, you probably need to find a way to stay hydrated. Moon Saturn can also be dry skin. If Saturn is representing the protective coverings of our bodies, then Moon Saturn can also be dry skin. So you need to moisturize. You need to make sure that your hair is moisturized, your nails are moisturized, because Moon Saturn can be the sapping of our natural inherent moisture content. Similar to Venus Saturn. Venus has to do with the natural oils that the body produces. And so sometimes when people have Venus Saturn, they also have to have a very serious regimen of taking in oils and specifically taking vitamin E or whatever so that they can stay moisturized and lubricated. So Moon Saturn, Venus Saturn are combinations of dehydration in general and the ways in which dehydration impacts the skin. So that's something to be mindful of. Moon Saturn also has to do with constipation and the way in which our digestive system, our gut, can become obstructed. Moon is gut, Saturn is obstruction. Moon, Saturn is gut obstruction. So that's another thing that we find with the Moon Saturn combination. When people have Moon and Saturn in a hard aspect relationship and that is squared by Neptune, that oftentimes can manifest as diarrhea. Whereas Moon Saturn by itself oftentimes manifests as constipation, Moon Saturn squared by Neptune manifests as diarrhea. I don't think Moon Neptune manifests as diarrhea by itself, but very often the Moon Saturn squared by Neptune manifests as diarrhea. So these are just some things to know in general. The Saturn, from a traditional perspective, also has to do with our bladder. So Moon Saturn can have to do with issues within our bladder as well. And who knows, maybe it has to do with urinary tract infections. I haven't done a robust body of research on that, but Moon Saturn has to do with issues with the bladder. The bladder isn't functioning, it's hurting to urinate, we can't get out our urine. All of these things are falling under the auspices of the Moon Saturn combination as well. Saturn has to do with the gifts we get from our ancestors. And sometimes the gifts we get from our ancestors are also the curses we get from our ancestors. So sometimes Moon Saturn can have to do with hereditary health problems. And I dare say hereditary female reproductive health problems, but sometimes Moon Saturn can have to do with hereditary health problems, hereditary gut health problems. All of these things can come under the auspices of the Moon and Saturn. Now, Moon Saturn finally, I believe, has to do with the denial of motherhood. And once again, if we're going to say anything, we have to see it 1,000 bajillion times, because I do not want to be reached out to after this because I said that you have Moon Saturn and therefore that means you're not going to have children, because I never said that. I said that Moon Saturn as a universal concept can have to do with the denial of a feeling of being mothered, and therefore it can also sometimes be connected to a denial of motherhood or having children at a very later time within our own life, because of this sense of us not really having the internal infrastructure in order to give birth earlier. So sometimes Moon Saturn can also have to do with that as well. Sometimes people could have Moon Saturn and they could say, well, hell, my mother wasn't really the best person in the world for me. Therefore, I don't want to repeat that ancestral thread and become not the best mother for somebody else. So therefore, I'm making an active decision not to be a mother within this lifetime. Sometimes that's how that manifests as well. So all of these things collectively are things that we can find when we have Moon and Saturn in hard aspect combination. Now that we've finished all of the traditional things, let's go into a world of weird. Starting with the combination of moon Chiron. Now, as we all know, Chiron stands between Saturn and Uranus. Chiron, I think, was discovered in the 1950s. Don't quote me, but I think Chiron was discovered in the 1950s. And Chiron has taken on this identity within astrology as being the wounded healer. Now, I heard that for years and years, and I thought people were stark raving lunatics when they would talk about Chiron. And I was like, why are all of these people talking about their Chiron? And I just didn't understand it. And I didn't even try to understand it. But then one day, somebody described a very specific type of relationship to their mother, and there was nothing else within their chart that represented the specific thing that they were trying to describe. And something within my gut said, Mychal, actually, that's not true. It wasn't even my gut. I think there was a fluke in my astrology software where one day Chiron just happened to be on the screen and it just never left the screen since then. So it wasn't my gut because my gut was hardwired not to pay attention to Chiron. So I would never have a psychic intuition to put Chiron on the screen because my intuition doesn't work like that. But Chiron was on the screen or something. I'm not really remembering the story correctly, but the point is Chiron was someplace. The moon Chiron was the description of this person's harrowing maternal story. So I said to the universe, if you want for me to build a body of research on this thing, then you have to send me the people who have these stories. And so said, so done. People started to come to me from all walks of life with the moon Chiron story. And they could have moon conjunct Chiron, moon square Chiron, moon opposite Chiron, moon quincunx Chiron, moon parallel Chiron, moon contraparallel Chiron. And all of their stories were the same 9 times out of 10. Now, as you all know, I tend to be an 8.5 times out of 10 sort of person, 8 times out of 10 sort of person. So if I say something happens 9 times out of 10, you can bet your lucky penny that I mean 9 times out of 10. The stories were, my mother didn't love me. My mother said she hated me. My mother didn't want children. My mother wanted a boy, but she got a girl. My mother wanted a dog, but she got a child. My mother locked herself in the bedroom and said she would commit suicide. My mother locked herself in the bedroom and actually did commit suicide. My mother was on horse tranquilizers. My mother didn't breastfeed me because she said she wasn't a cow. All of these things about the mother happens with the moon Chiron. And then, serendipitously, as fortune would have it, I started to find a particular pattern between these people with the moon Chiron stories and people who have very serious gut health issues. And I started this with somebody who has colitis. And it kept on cropping up. The same people who had the moon Chiron stories descriptive of their mothers had moon Chiron descriptive of their gut health issues. I have colitis. I have Crohn's disease. I have all of these things that make it very difficult for me to eat food. I have a very small window of things that I can actually eat because I'm allergic to everything. It was always these harrowing stories in which the gut became the primary wound within that person's body. So these are the things I have to say about Chiron. And these are the things I have to say about the moon Chiron. I really don't have much more to say about it other than that. And this came from my actual applied client work and research. Because as you all also know, I don't really like to read other people's books on modern astrological concepts. If I'm going to bring in Maki, I don't even know if that's what it's called, Hayamaki, whatever. If I'm going to bring in Maki into my astrology, it's going to happen on my own terms, not because I'm parroting something that somebody else said. So, no. I did not read Melanie Reinhardt's book on Chiron before I started doing my own Chiron research because that's not how I've approached any body of astrological research. However, when I did share my own Chiron research with Melanie Reinhardt, she was kind of blown away by it because it was another perspective of the Moon Chiron story. I even shared my Moon Chiron research with Judith Hill, who is definitely a Chiron denier, and even Judith. And I'm not going to go into the reasons as to why she became convinced that it was true, but even Judith, upon hearing it, she said, wow, Mychal, I'm thinking back at some charts that I know about, and it's actually quite true what you're saying about the Moon Chiron situation. So the Moon Chiron has been tested, the Moon Chiron has been proven. Go forth and conquer with the Moon Chiron because chances are you're going to be correct. So that's how I feel about the moon Chiron. And if a person does not have the moon Chiron manifesting as the maternal wound, then chances are the person has the moon Chiron manifesting as the gut health problems. 9 times out of 10. You still leave a 1 time to possibly be wrong, but 9 times out of 10, that's how it manifests. Now, the next combination we have is Moon Uranus. Moon Uranus is another thing that we find within the charts of people who have a very high strung nervous system in general and a very reactive, responsive nervous system in general. Moon Uranus can give a person a very real amount of fear that they constantly live with within their lives. And Moon Uranus can also create a sense of hypervigilance all the time. You're on all the time and you don't know how to turn yourself off because you're constantly engaged, you're constantly aware, you're constantly waiting for the ball to drop. These are some of the ways how the Moon Uranus can manifest. So we find with the moon Uranus this overstimulation of the nervous system that can fundamentally lead to a breakdown in health in general. So that's the moon Uranus on the one side of things. However, the moon Uranus person could be a very exciting person to be around, a very stimulating person to be around. The moon Uranus person can always have something quick or witty to say or share. The moon Uranus person is the person who's thinking 10,000 miles per hour, and they have the ability to extract from their 10,000 thoughts wonderful things that are salient and that are meaningful and that are actually impactful. Moon Uranus is one of the astrologer signatures in much the same way as Mercury Uranus is an astrologer signature, in much the same way as Sun Uranus is an astrologer signature, because the Moon Uranus gives a person the sort of rapid mental processing necessary in order to practice astrology in a way that makes sense. However, similar to all of these Uranus combinations, Sun Uranus, Mercury Uranus, Moon Uranus, what we oftentimes find is that we either have the person who is able to practice very, very good, penetrating, focused astrology, or we have the person who practices astrology that is scattered, that is wild, and that is chaotic. And we undoubtedly have a lot of that astrology that exists within the world at large. So if you're a Moon Uranus person, Sun Uranus, Mercury Uranus person, and you practice astrology, then you should really take a look at your astrological practice to make sure that you are actually grounding the lightning of your astrological practice in something that you can streamline and package and share with others, because sometimes when people get a reading from a Moon Uranus person, they leave the reading feeling even more frazzled because the reading feels like electricity and it doesn't actually have a grounding mechanism within it. This is something that's useful for all of us as astrologers, but I think also all of us as astrologers, for the most part, we tend to have some Uranus something within our charts. Therefore, we can all benefit from finding a grounding mechanism and a rubric within which to practice the sorts of astrology that we love. So those are some of the ways how Moon Uranus can show up. Now, Moon Uranus is also something that keeps a person awake. It doesn't keep us as awake as Mercury Uranus, which we know is the combination for insomnia, but Moon Uranus is something that can keep a person turned on and stimulated always. It has to do with revolutions that are specifically spearheaded by women. It has to do with the Women's March. It has to do with anything that represents a body of women specifically standing up and saying that we don't want to follow the rules established by the patriarchy. Moon Uranus gives us that as well. It represents an uproar of women. Now, on a more personal level, Moon Uranus can manifest as the woman who doesn't necessarily want to fulfill the societal gender norms of what it means to be a woman. So she doesn't want to be a mother. She doesn't want to be your wife. She doesn't even want to be a girlfriend. She wants to be a free, independent woman who has the freedom to come and go as she pleases and who has the freedom to choose to put on a role or not put on that role, but she doesn't just want to be thrusted into a particular role based on her association with you, me, or anybody. So that's something that we're finding with the Moon Uranus from the perspective of womanhood specifically. Sometimes women who have the Moon Uranus, they have this internal sense that to give birth to children is going to diminish their freedom. or they have this sense that being a mother is going to dampen their life or rain on their parade. And so sometimes women who have moon Uranus can stave off the act of conception or can stave off being a mother because they want to hold on to their freedom as far as they could push their biological clock. So that's one of the things that we find with moon Uranus. Now, on this same note, moon Uranus within our charts can sometimes manifest as us having mothers who didn't really know how to settle into the role or the shape of motherhood in a very settled way that made us feel very consistently loved or attended to. It could have to do with us having the rapidly moving mother who wasn't really a great source of stability within our own lives. Moon Uranus can also have to do with us coming from a domestic environment that is constantly in a state of flux and reflux, where we find ourselves moving around a lot as children, and therefore we don't really have a sense of being rooted within the world in a profound way as far as our domestic background is concerned. So this is another way how Moon Uranus can manifest within our lives. Moon Uranus can also manifest from a health perspective as a woman who has an erratic menstrual cycle in general. And by erratic, I mean it's here today, it's gone today. It's heavy this week, it's gone next week. It came after 3 weeks, and next week it came after 6 weeks. I have scanty flow at this moment, heavy flow at the other moment. Some months I miss my menstruation altogether and I wonder if I'm pregnant, but I'm not actually pregnant. I just have a menstrual cycle that's all over the place. So this is something else that we find within the charts of women who have moon Uranus. Now, Uranus has to do with technology, which I'm sure we're all aware of, and the moon has to do with childbirth, conception, pregnancy, all of these things. So sometimes moon Uranus can indicate a woman who only has the opportunity to conceive and to carry her pregnancy to term based on some medical intervention. So it's not just that she can have unprotected sexual intercourse with a man and then get pregnant that way. It can manifest as a woman who has to have some medical intervention, such as IVF or such as some other form of hormone therapy as a means of successfully conceiving, being pregnant, and having a child. So these are some of the ways how we see the moon Uranus manifesting. A more fickle way that we see the moon Uranus manifesting is people who are very, very picky eaters. I'm not a moon Uranus person, but I'm a picky eater. But we do see this manifesting within the charts of people who are very picky eaters. And by picky eaters, I mean they're not going to eat mashed potatoes if they see a tiny piece of potato that didn't actually get mashed. By picky eaters, I mean they're only going to eat the Oreo if the Oreo has been specifically cut into 4 segments and has had the internal frosting placed on top of the 2 Oreo cookies. That's the sort of picky eater I'm talking about. People who have food specificities that are knocking futs, that are just beyond belief in general. These are some of the things that we find when people have moon Uranus. Interestingly, many people who have moon in hard aspect to Uranus are vegetarians. But often their vegetarian story is, I became a vegetarian because I'm a picky eater, but I couldn't remain a vegetarian because I developed an iron deficiency, and therefore I had to return to eating meat because I got sick from being a vegetarian. That's another story that we oftentimes find with people who have moon Uranus, this sense of them wanting to take their picky eating to the extreme and then becoming the most vegan-y vegans in the whole vegan kingdom, and they can't hold on to that, and it becomes unsustainable for them because they're not getting the correct sort of nutrients and vitamins and minerals that they need in order to sustain a healthy life being a vegetarian. Now, as a yoga practitioner, I tend to hold this utopian belief that we're all supposed to be vegetarians. Or I held that utopian belief for a very long time that we're all supposed to be vegetarians. And I also held the utopian belief that you could be a vegetarian if you tried, you're just not trying hard enough. But the reality is that there are some people who just cannot be vegetarians within this lifetime and they have to eat meat. I knock on wood and I'm very grateful that I'm not one of those people, but many people, whether they have moon Uranus or whether they just have life in general, they cannot be vegetarians because being a vegetarian makes them far more sick and it's actually not worth it in the end. So that's the Moon Uranus, and I think those are all the things I have to say about the Moon Uranus together. Now, moving on, the next combination we have is Moon Neptune. Moon Neptune is the combination of sleep. It's literally the combination of going to sleep. It's also a combination of dreams and dream work in general. So if you're a Moon Neptune person, you probably have a very vivid sleep life. You probably have a very vivid dream life. You probably are someone with a very vivid imagination in general, because these are things that Moon Neptune represents. Moon Neptune people have a very highly refined sensitivity, which is wonderful if you're going into a field that requires that level of highly refined sensitivity. If you're a doctor, and you have Moon Neptune, that can be great because you know where to put the needle even if you don't know where to put the needle. If you are a psychic medium, that can be great, even though, as you all know, for me, the jury is out on the psychic mediumship thing, but I'm more willing to believe that someone is a psychic medium if they have their Moon in the hard aspect with Neptune than if they have their Mercury in the hard aspect with Neptune, because Mercury, Neptune, is deception. Whereas Moon Neptune is, they're just so lost in the spirit world that they can't actually deceive you because they're just so caught up within the spiritual side of life. So Moon Neptune is very good for people who are working within the spiritual industry, people who are working within medicine, people who are working as healers. All of these things are good. Moon Neptune is good for pharmacists, people who are working with drugs. Moon Neptune is good for the illegal pharmacist as well, the other type of drug dealer. Moon Neptune is good for all things that have the ability to alter our consciousness. People who are really into mushrooms and psychedelics today, they more than likely have Moon Neptune doing something within their chart, because Moon Neptune is a very psychedelic sort of combination. And I think it's either Moon Neptune or it's Moon Pluto, but the whole psychedelic realm of things comes from that realm, the realm that Moon Neptune creates and also the realm that Moon Pluto creates, and for different reasons. People who have Moon Neptune, they want to dissolve and become everything. People who have Moon Pluto, they want to self-annihilate and become nothing. And this doesn't necessarily mean that someone is going to want to take their own life when you have Moon Pluto, but when you have Moon Pluto, it can give you a sense of fearlessness that causes you to dwell where angels fear to tread, or you want to actively be a part of some form of work or some form of something that causes you to destroy the singularity of your individual ego. And so from that perspective, Moon Pluto people gravitate towards psychedelics, they gravitate towards shamanism, they gravitate towards, what's that other thing that people started to do where they try to crawl back into their mother's womb? They gravitate towards rebirthing, they gravitate towards holotropic breathwork, they gravitate towards those sort of things. Those are Moon Pluto people, the people who aren't afraid of death, and they actively try to create circumstances of death that don't actually kill them. That's a Moon Pluto thing. It's not a Moon Neptune thing. People who are Moon Neptune, they want to melt, and they want to become the fungi, and they want to become the trees, and they want to become the stars, and they want to become the bees. It's actually, as I think about it, because I'm not that type of person, it's quite overwhelming to, want to do that. But that can be how Moon Neptune is manifesting within the life of a person. It makes a person highly sensitive as well. And so that sensitivity can be great for those fields that I mentioned. And for the same reason, that sensitivity can be a problem for those fields that I mentioned. Because within those fields that I mentioned, those people can be sponges, psychic sponges of what's going on within their environment, and everything about the world can feel harsh to them. When a person has Moon Neptune, quite similar to when a person has Sun Neptune, they can feel as if they step into this world without skin. And they can feel as if there's a fundamental part of their constitution that is raw and that is just open to the onslaught of the world around them, that can cause them to feel as if the world around them isn't the safest place in the world. So Moon Neptune people need to have more systems of self-care, more systems of self-therapy, more opportunities to break away from society and get lost in nature. They need to have more downtime, more recuperative time, because they're systems require that much more level of care and consideration. Now, Moon Neptune, from the perspective of our dietary health, oftentimes manifests as people who have very intensive food allergies, whereas the person who has Moon Uranus intellectually think they have food allergies and they psych themselves up That's another thing. People who have moon Uranus are hypochondriacs. They psych themselves up into always thinking they're sick. Whereas people who have moon Neptune, they don't need to psych themselves up into always thinking they're sick, because chances are, if you're a moon Neptune person and that's all you have going on for your moon within your chart, then chances are you are quite frequently sick, or you are quite frequently under the weather. Or even if somebody looks at you from 10 miles away who happens to have the cold, then you end up with the next pandemic. So the reality is that Moon Neptune is a very challenging combination in terms of our physiological health, and it gives us a very physiologically sensitive system. And sometimes it could even make us a little bit feeble, and it can even make us not have that much energy in general to defend ourselves from the perspective of our immune system from most of the things that life throws our way or that life throws around us. The sensitive gut is a very big part of that. And so you might already know that you're allergic to everything, including dust. However, the reality is that if you have more Neptune, then sometimes that can manifest as having these very real gut health issues that are directly connected to certain foods that you eat. Even if those foods are foods that you love. Sometimes people can be a vegetarian and have more Neptune, and then they find that they're allergic to tofu. If you're allergic to tofu, what else are you going to eat? So the reality is that the moon Neptune is a very crazy combination, especially from the perspective of our gut health. It's also a very drug sensitive combination. When people have more Neptune, they can be very sensitive to drugs. If you take one Panadol, then the more Neptune person needs a quarter of a Panadol, because drugs within their system just don't agree. Which is interesting, because sometimes we do find people who have more Neptune gravitating towards drugs as a means of disappearing, dissolving, and doing that whole escapist thing. But the reality is that more Neptune people need to stay away from alcohol, more Neptune people need to stay away from drugs, and very oftentimes when you tell somebody to stay away from things, those are the things that they already tend to gravitate towards. So these are some of the ways how the moon Neptune can manifest in general. Another thing, which I think is a tiny thing, but it's probably not that tiny, is that sometimes when you have moon Neptune, from a medical astrology perspective, you never really know how to pinpoint what's wrong with you. Because moon Neptune, the moon is the ocean and Neptune is the ocean, which means ocean plus ocean only creates a vast realm of possibilities as to what might possibly be ailing me. So moon Neptune people are oftentimes people who don't know what's wrong with them. They just know that everything's wrong with them because the issues that they have are decentralized everywhere within their systems. Moon Neptune can also be edema, where people have swelling of their limbs because they just hold excess fluid within themselves in general. Because Moon Neptune also has to do with sleep, Moon Neptune can also have to do with people who sometimes suffer from blackouts, or people who lose massive chunks of memory that they can't reclaim. So when you hear somebody saying, hey, I can't remember what happened to me between the age of 13 and 18, sometimes that can be attributed to their Moon Neptune. That could also sometimes be a Moon Pluto situation, especially if there was a trauma piece attached to that, where we amputate our memory as a means of living life. But more often than not, we find the blackout of consciousness occurring between Moon Neptune, especially if a person has their Moon Neptune hard aspect also in hard aspect with Uranus, that has to do with the loss of waking consciousness. Now, there are some people who think that Moon Neptune has to do with asthma. I'm not one of those people. And the reason I'm not one of those people is because for me, Moon Mercury Neptune is asthma, whereas Moon Neptune has more to do with our digestive health in general and our malfunctioning digestive system. So that's how I would interpret the Moon Neptune piece. But who knows? If you have asthma and you have Moon Neptune, probably that's another way it shows up. But for me, when people have asthma, it more so shows up with the hard aspect between the Moon, Mercury, and Neptune. Now, the very last thing we have is Moon Pluto. Moon Pluto in positive aspect gives people a gut of steel. Moon Pluto in hard aspect oftentimes gives people a gut that cannot tolerate anything. And when we speak about gut trauma, that comes from the fact that Pluto is trauma and the moon is the gut. So Moon Pluto can manifest as gut trauma, especially gut trauma having to do with the colon. The reason I say the colon is because we consider Pluto to also be on the spectrum of feces. So moon Pluto within our bodies can have to do with issues with the colon in general. Moon Pluto can manifest as fistulas. It can manifest as hemorrhoids. It can manifest as any sort of abnormal growth that we have along our large intestines in general, because Pluto has to do with abnormal growth and Moon has to do with that part of the body in general. So Moon Pluto, sometimes when people have that from a medical astrology perspective, they have very serious gut health issues and they have very traumatic gut health issues, particularly within the large intestine. Now, I don't necessarily think that the large intestine is the only frontier for the Moon Pluto, because we sometimes find Moon Pluto within the charts of people who have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO. However, for me, I tend to think of the Moon Pluto combination as being more indicative of things that are going on within our colon specifically. So that's Moon Pluto. Moon, because the moon also represents the womb, Moon Pluto is something that we also find within the charts of people who have excessive bleeding during menstruation. We get the excessive from Pluto, and we also kind of get the bleeding from Pluto as well. So the excessive bleeding part or the excessive trauma part is coming from Pluto. Now, Moon Pluto is one of the things that we do oftentimes see within the charts of women who have endometriosis. And it is something that we oftentimes see within the charts of women who have had to have hysterectomies as a result of their endometriosis. Now, once again, there are multiple factors that have to be at play. And I feel like a broken record at this point because I've said this so frequently. But if it's one thing the internet knows how to do, it's to take things out of context. So it isn't just Moon Pluto that represents a hysterectomy or that represents endometriosis, but it often is a part of a larger framework of considerations where we do find that being a part of a woman's health story in general. So that's the Moon Pluto. It's a very traumatic thing in terms of the womb. It's a very traumatic thing in terms of the gut as well. Those are the two places where it tends to manifest from a physiological perspective. Now, Moon Pluto, from the perspective of our mother, more often than not, we have to see it amongst multiple corroborating factors. It's not just a one thing. So if your child has Moon Pluto and you're a mother, just know that it has to happen within multiple corroborating factors. Moon Pluto can oftentimes represent the gaslighting mother, the manipulative mother, the mother who abused me as a child, and then as I grew up, she told me that I made it all up within my mind. The mother who ruled with an iron fist, the mother who made sure that everything was to her liking, which oftentimes meant that it was to nobody else's liking. The mother who made me feel small because her presence was so large and so oppressive. These are some of the ways how the Moon Pluto can show up within the life of someone who has this combination. Another thing that we find with people who have Moon Pluto is that they oftentimes find themselves being the receptacle of all of the garbage that goes on within their family. Kind of like your descending colon. So very often when people have Moon Pluto in hard aspects within their chart, all of the filth and all of the pain and all of the suffering and all of the everything that occurs within their lives from a familial perspective, or that occurs within their family just from a genealogical perspective, tends to land on their shoulders. So in families, we have different people who hold different things. We have some people who are the secret keepers, we have some people who are the recipe keepers, and we have some people who are the garbage keepers. And very often when you have Moon Pluto, you could feel as if you are a person who is holding on to the traumatic content that has occurred within your domestic sphere, or you're holding on to the traumatic content that has occurred within your family. This is a combination that we oftentimes find within the charts of people who have mental health issues and who have mental health crises that are hereditary within their family as well. So there has been a bit of research done within this as far as people who have hereditary schizophrenia, or people who are so torn or schismed within themselves as a result of all of the trauma that's occurred within their family, that they create multiple versions of themselves so that they can better compartmentalize some of the pain and suffering that they've been through from within the context of their family home as well. So these are the ways how the Moon-Pluto combination tends to manifest. Moon-Pluto, from a positive perspective, manifests as someone who isn't afraid to do a deep dive into the filth, which is why Moon-Pluto, even more so than Moon-Neptune people, are better suited for working with people as psychologists, or working with people as hypnotherapists or healers or counselors or any of these things, because the Moon Pluto has the intestinal fortitude in order to delve into the feces of human experience in general. A Moon Pluto person could be a butt doctor. What is that called? I think it's called a proctologist. A Moon Pluto person could be somebody who specializes in anal health. And so we find that there is once again this sense of not being afraid to delve into the depths of the darkness and not being afraid to take healing to where it's needed the most, not being afraid of taboo parts of society, not being afraid of taboo topics. And so the people who have Moon Pluto have the ability to go a further distance in terms of their ability to delve into the darkness and find the light that is within that darkness, as opposed to people who have a much less robust constitution, which we probably would find with somebody who has the Moon Neptune, who probably still has the same capacity to do that work, and they have the sensitivity to do that work well, but they don't necessarily have the gut strength to stay within that work for a consistent level of time without them absorbing some of the garbage that's occurring within their environment. So Moon Pluto is a very powerful combination. It's a powerful combination for women. If you are a woman with Moon Pluto, then you probably show up within the world as a powerful woman. You probably show up in the world as someone who has had to navigate your own fair share of an extraordinary amount of trauma within your life. Therefore, there isn't much that frightens you, and there isn't much that actually makes you feel as if it's going to kill you, because you've gone through everything in life that could possibly kill you, and you are still here to tell the tale. Moon Pluto gives us resolve, conviction, self-assurance, certainty. It gives us an indefatigable ability to face challenges and to face odds in life that other people would definitely be fatigued by, and it causes us to be able to face those things with a sense of stability and a robust sense of self-knowing within ourselves. So all things have their multiple sides. On the one hand, Moon Pluto tends to manifest in the way that I just described. If your mother wasn't actually the person who was doing the gaslighting and the pain and all of these things to you, then chances are your mother's mother or your mother's relationship to how she was mothered is where this manifests within her life. And perhaps your mother, as a powerful woman, chose not to replicate that part of her ancestral trauma with you. So that's also something that we see. Sometimes it skips a generation. It happened with how our grandmother was towards our mother. And as a result of that, our mother becomes this robust, powerful woman because she never wants to manifest that within our own lives as well. So these are the ways how we see Moon Pluto manifesting. One, from the perspective of our mother. Two, from the perspective of ourselves. And three, from the perspective of our health and vitality within this lifetime. Thank you all so much for joining me once again for yet another episode of Planetary Pairs, in which I take you through the planetary pairs. This week we spoke all about the moon, and I really hope that something that I shared with you here gives you some level of insight or some level of clarity or just a deeper level of knowing how to work with planets on their own terms. As always, if you benefit from the work that we're doing here on the Oraculos Podcast, then by all means take a moment. If you've listened for this far, then please take a moment, go down below, hit the subscription button, and also hit the notification bell so that you receive notifications of when we come out with these episodes on a daily basis. I'm so grateful to have you here as a part of our astrological family. If you ever want to join any of the live recordings of these episodes of the Oraculos Podcast, then check out our website at www.oraculosastrology.com and make sure that you sign up for our newsletter so that you can become a part of our Oraculos community. Because when you become a part of our Oraculos community, you get free lectures that I've never posted anywhere before. You get free chapters of my book that I've never posted and that aren't even in book form anywhere at this moment. There's so much goodies that I give you when you become a part of our Oraculos community, and all you have to do is sign up for our newsletter. Also, I want to remind you that we have our upcoming Uranian Astrology for Practicing Astrologers intensive, and that's coming up in January 2024, where I will teach you everything you need to know in order to practice Uranian astrology within your client-based astrology work so that you can perform more profound, robust, and planet-based, accurate, prediction-based readings for your clients. So if you're ready to take your astrology to a whole new level, then by all means join us for our upcoming Uranian Astrology for Practicing Astrologers intensive. And as always, thank you for choosing the Oraculos School of Astrology and the Oraculos Podcast to be your astrological home here on the internet. Until next time, I'm Mychal, Bryan, leaving you in peace and love and hope. Until we meet again. Have a good one. Bye-bye.